Agree.
You see, I'm getting you there. You're coming my way, Jemma.
No, I won't be voting for your party. But again, that is a Brexit benefit is in our
Fundamentally,
water, and
the
so
campaign was take control of money laws and borders.
This is Jemma Forte, an influencer and a political podcaster.
As a country, as a nation, honestly, the rest of the world is looking at us going, what the hell is going on?
And she took on Reform Party leader Richard Tice, and they talked about a series of topics related to Brexit. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit the subscribe and like button. Let's start off with the conspiracies. Number 1, the myth.
There are many problems with the country at the moment. Many challenges. We can agree on that. But that's not to do with Brexit. That is to do with the utter failure of this Conservative government to run the country properly.
There's no shortage of cryptids in the world, and it seems that Brexit has become one of them. It's elusive. No one seems to be able to find an economic benefit to it, apart from now Richard Tice, because he's the one that can solve the problems. Ever heard that before? I'll go to Loch Ness and I'll find that monster. It's just that people haven't been doing it right.
Workers, and there are labour shortages across the board, and
there's not a
with
labour
the
shortage in this
highest...
country.
That's right, apparently there's no labour shortage, so this 1 million vacancies that we have for jobs doesn't exist. Or why the NFU are turning around and saying they lost 60 million in half a year because crops were left to rot in fields because they didn't have enough workers. No labour shortage there at all. It's not the EU anymore, it's now people on benefits according to Richard.
What we've got is a willing worker shortage because, regrettably, we've got 5.2 million on benefits. It doesn't, for many people, work doesn't pay.
I'm going to break down those statistics shortly, but isn't it interesting that it's always the poor? He hits the people that can't defend themselves. I never hear him complaining about the rich taking their taxes offshore. Do you? Where have we heard this before? The Conservative Party.
We've hampered business.
Give me some evidence of something that has gone wrong because of Brexit.
All right, so one off the top of my head is that we culled 120,000 perfectly healthy pigs because they had a shortage of agricultural workers to do that. Now, that's just one little travesty.
It's a false piece of evidence. That's
No,
not
it
the number
100%
that was
isn't.
culled.
The numbers might not be correct, but it's still 40 to 35,000 depending on who you read. But Richard's okay with that because obviously he's not poor, so he doesn't get affected by price increases. But also know that still happened because of Brexit, and Richard just doesn't want to take that into account.
Because whilst, yes, we have a record amount of people coming to the country and we haven't put any money into services or building houses in the last 10 years.
I'm going to challenge you on this pitch thing. It's really important because we've got a seasonal agricultural workers scheme that replaced freedom of movement, in which tens of thousands of people can come over for a number of months.
Numbers I've read suggest that there are only 40,000 visas. We need about 80,000. Again, Richard doesn't point that out.
Deal with that.
It hasn't worked. If you talk to farmers, if you actually talk to the people...
I talk to farmers every week.
Here's some advice for Richard Tice.
We have 2 ears, but only one mouth. So a good leader will listen twice as much as he shouts.
Yeah, well, then you'll know. I mean, there's evidence all over the place. If you look at someone like Liz Webster, who's really sticking up for them and has got so many campaigns going on, and you talk to them themselves, they don't have the workers. And this idea, you say about all those people being on benefits, yes, absolutely. But many of them are working. No, many of them are working already. And they have the benefits to complement their meagre wages.
They're working up to 16 hours a week, claiming benefits of the balance because their net weekly take-home pay is more than if they were working 40 hours a week.
We're getting too much of that, and I suggest you shut up.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, he is talking a little bit too much, so I'm going to just interject and say, how about this? He says he's not a Tory. Have a listen to Priti Patel.
There are 8.45 million British people in the United Kingdom that are economically inactive.
Okay.
I'm not a Tory.
Where they have...
So let's break down those figures. 27% are students, 26% are long-term sick, 22% are carers, and 13% are retired. As I said, Richard's like Nigel. He's a conspiracy theorist.
Now, I watched your Leave EU advert on the way here today, and honestly, I looked at that and I thought, I am not surprised people saw that and voted for Brexit. You promised that we would be living in something equivalent to a spa. The music was beautiful, the light was rosy, and you told us that education would be fantastic, that the NHS would be amazing. You get a doctor's appointment pretty much the next day.
The campaign was take control of money laws and borders.
It wasn't take control of money, land and borders. Have a listen to the advert.
You will benefit from better care.
Lie.
To reduced waiting times for you and your loved one.
Lie.
Better prospects for your children.
Lie.
Your wages will rise thanks to better controlled immigration.
Lie.
Your weekly food shop will become cheaper.
Not going to lie, the number of falsehoods is quite triggering.
You and your family will benefit from a resurgent economy.
More lies.
With less pressure on housing younger generations will also find it easier to get on the housing ladder.
No, they won't.
Politicians, both local and national, will become more accountable.
In your dreams. Was it any of this? Did it work?
That every aspect of our lives would be improved, that our weekly food shop would be down. This was lies, a pack of lies, pack of lies.
Jemma listened, and Richard hasn't. And look at that smug little grin on his face as she pulls him up on it. Well done, Jemma.
Because not one of those things has come true.
These are opportunities that still exist with a government that runs the country properly. It's absolutely
You can't blame
clear.
a government who had an 80-seat majority where they literally
exactly.
got rid of anybody who wanted a softer Brexit or who didn't want Brexit at all.
80-seat majority, they could have done it and they haven't. They've
Why
chosen,
didn't they?
Because they've chosen through incompetence not to do it.
No,
and because
it's
actually the truth is
because
many of them actually didn't believe in Brexit, and we've got a civil service that's put up roadblocks every single possible along the way.
And that's the biggest conspiracy of them all. Everyone's against Brexit. Only he can be the saviour. I almost look at him like he's some sort of poor man's Darth Vader, and Nigel Farage is also a poor man's emperor. I don't understand how this level of paranoia and delusion is spewing from their mouths, other than to think that they're conspiracy theorists and essentially that the world is against them and that they're the only ones that can save us. And this is why I always make that comparison with cryptids. It's this myth that can only be resolved through them because they are the saviours of Brexit. It cannot be saved, and we'll go into more detail about that later on in the video.
With Brexit, a failure.
It is all linked.
The NHS has more money poured into it than ever, way more than
we have
that number
lost
on the side
so
of the
many
bus.
workers.
There's an element of truth here. Money has gone up, but there's also a huge level of deception going on with Richard. In front, you can see a graph stating all investment over the last 4 decades. And so despite this claim of all this investment, it hasn't kept up with inflation. And to be perfectly honest, it's been a complete drag. So when that money came back into the NHS, well, it did help, but it didn't solve the problems of the past decade caused by the Conservative government. But the other pattern I'm starting to notice? Richard seems to flip-flap when it suits. So the NHS, it's nothing to do with Brexit, but when it's a positive, it's all to do with Brexit. And that leads on to another point. We're still paying money into the EU. In fact, when Theresa May started that deal, it was in 2018, and look how much money we were still paying in, all the way up until 2021. That means that money was always there. The government didn't want to spend it on the NHS. They probably wanted to run it down, but because of Brexit, they had to push forward with a pledge. It means that Brexit wasn't the issue that Richard made it out to be and is now denying is an issue.
Let's go back to things like the Good Friday Agreement and how both John Major and Tony Blair spoke about how Northern Ireland was going to be affected really detrimentally by Brexit.
Yes, let's focus on that, because Richard here and his emperor Nigel made a massive hash-up. I assume Nigel was aiming at one stage at Ireland, trying to get them to leave the EU in a campaign, which would resolve a lot of the issues over Northern Ireland, and it completely backfired. But let's have a listen to Richard Tice first, talk about his thoughts on Northern Ireland when asked a very direct question about people, not economics.
You recently accused our Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, of hijacking the Brexit issue and claimed that the amount of trade crossing the Irish border was, to use your own words, and I quote, irrelevant. Can I say as a point of information, there is no such thing as an Irish land border. It is a UK border imposed on the island of Ireland. The Irish border is the sea. If you think it is irrelevant, can you now speak to the social and political implications to the people of Northern Ireland if a hard border is introduced, if you care so at all?
A picture tells 1,000 words, right? Think of a glass jar with 1,000 Smarties in it.
I was going to note your analogy, which was horrific, by the way.
Oh, hang on. 1,000 Smarties. Those Smarties represent all of the trade that goes across all the 28 countries in Europe. Okay? The trade that goes across that Irish border is between 1 and 2 Smarties. It is a tiny, tiny amount.
How dare you? This is not about economics. I've asked you about the social and political implications for the people of Northern Ireland if a hard border is introduced.
It's not going to be introduced because everybody has said it's not going to be.
When you say everyone's not said it's going to be, that's not what Jean-Claude Juncker has said. He said there has to be. We can't just have animals coming across the border without being checked.
You know better than the people of Northern Ireland, the politicians of the Republic of Ireland. And
everybody has said they're not going to impose a hard border.
The head of the police force in Northern Ireland says he worries this could be a trigger for violence. Is he part of a Remain conspiracy as well?
I don't... Look, the reality is...
Or you you know more about policing in Northern Ireland than the head of the police?
No, of course I don't. But there is no reason for that to be the case.
So when Assistant Chief Constable Barbara Gray, who heads up the counter-terrorism unit in Northern Ireland, says we predict that a 6 to 12-month period, if there's a no-deal Brexit, there could be an upsurge in violence. That doesn't worry you at all?
Look, of course everybody should be worried if,
You don't sound very worried. You just made an analogy about Smarties, and we're talking about the return of violence.
I used an economic point.
But we're not talking economics. That's what
let's go back.
Let's about violence. Before I go back to the audience, let's deal with the violence point. Then we have to move.
No one wants violence. Let's be very clear.
Yes,
but let's go back.
People are warning of violence, Richard. What do you say to them?
I know that you apologised for the birthday greeting which you delivered in the last couple of days, but I want people to see just how much you know about the history and culture on this island.
Now, it's a bit early in the day, so all I've got actually is coffee, but I hope you enjoy a few pints with the lads tonight. Up the Ra.
Up the Ra, Nigel. I mean, I know that you said sorry. I know you get 87 quid. It's entirely within your rights to do that. But come on, don't try and lecture the Irish people about the culture and history and precarious nature of peace on this island. You haven't got a clue.
Do you know, the whole con about if you believe in Brexit a bit harder, it's going to be absolutely marvellous, I think has gone down the toilet. If you look at polls now, even a really high percentage of Leavers regret it. They think it has failed.
20% regret it.
No,
do you remember the polls in the week?
The
polls in the week up to the referendum were the same as the polls now. Guess what? On the day, we won the referendum.
They won with a 2% margin by overspending and breaking the law by 10%. And it was interesting to see that they pulled up that poll from YouGov. But have a look at this. Was it right or wrong to leave the EU? And wrong is about 60%. Right is dropping to about 35%, and it will continue to drop because the youth population are pretty hacked off under 25s about having been forced to leave the EU and have no say.
People aren't stupid. They go to the shop and they can't afford their weekly shop. Our fuel bills. Now, I know that there's other factors. Yes,
have you
absolutely.
Heard of the energy crisis?
Of course.
Have you heard of the madness of net zero putting up our energy bills?
Of course.
Nothing to do with Brexit.
Except that's not what the experts and economists are saying.
We're not really seeing disproportionate wage growth in those sectors. Wages are falling in real terms. And indeed, in the latest data, it's really only the top 1% who obviously are not working in accommodation or hospitality for the most part. What we've seen in the latest data is actually the strongest wage growth is in bankers' bonuses. I certainly wouldn't say, oh, well, Brexit has been good for the bankers. What we can say, I think so, is at least so far, Brexit hasn't really reduced those pay differentials in the way that some people said it might do.
In fact, the only two areas of growth in the United Kingdom are Northern Ireland and London. London, because it's a very diverse and flexible economy, but Northern Ireland, because it stayed inside the single market. And all this is doing is exaggerating the North-South divide and showing that actually remaining in the EU, we'd probably be flying ahead and supporting the EU in flying ahead.
Anybody with half a brain understands that these things are nuanced and they are complex. And of course, things like the Ukraine war have a massive impact on our food prices as well. But by putting in barriers, by raising the price of our exports, our imports, we have got less investment. That is just a fact.
We haven't raised the price of our exports.
Sorry, I know that was the wrong way to say that. Our imports, yes. But by putting
it's not the price has gone up. Right, what this government unbelievably has put in place unnecessary paperwork on imports. I agree with you on that, but again, that's an utter failure of implementation.
Exports are down, trade intensity is down. It's not recovering. The pound is down. That means you buy stuff from abroad is now more expensive, and it has not recovered since Brexit. Trade's down, and all because of Brexit. It's added paperwork, and the weird thing is that Richard is advocating that he wants open borders.
Let's look at the infrastructure. Okay, so the reason that, okay, you know that in October things are going to get even worse when checks finally come in. The checks that they've delayed 4 times now because
checks
the
that
government...
we don't need to bring in. If I was running the country, those checks wouldn't be there because they're not needed. This is the madness of the hopeless civil service failure of implementation.
But also, you know what? It's really interesting. So they only are not needed if you want to not care about standards anymore, or health, or safety. You know, these idea that regulations are bad is an absolute nonsense.
Smart regulations are good. Daft regulations are bad.
Well, some
Correct.
of those regulations that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg want to throw in the bin are workers' regulations. And I personally think that having our weekends protected, having maternity pay protected,
Has Jacob
having
said he
all
wants
of
to put
those
those
things...
workers' regulations in the bin?
He is a disaster capitalist. He has made a huge amount of money. And that is why we've now got 177 billionaires in this country. And while normal people are suffering, and every single household, depending on what you read, between £1,000 and £4,000 a year worse off.
Absolutely spot on. The only people that are benefiting out of this are the rich. And Richard has no plan to address that other than to increase the tax threshold. And that means you've got less money to invest in the NHS. That money's got to come from somewhere for medical bills, and it's either out of your pocket or it's the government's. And believe you and me, it's a lot cheaper coming from the government, who've got better purchasing power than individuals who are frankly going to get exploited by private insurance companies and private healthcare.
By lifting the starting point at which you pay income tax with the Reform UK's policy from 12.5 grand to 20 grand. If you run the country properly, if you focus the opportunities on the lowest paid, the least well off, you get millions of people back into jobs, you protect our own citizens, which means you don't need to import cheap, low-skilled labour from overseas.
Except Richard, being a bit of a thicko, doesn't realise that our birth rate is dropping and continues to drop. It's pretty simple. We need more kids to be able to continue a capitalist system, if we want to. And Richard and his cabal and other Brexiteers are so obsessed with free trade, they don't give a shit about you, me, or your children. That's why people aren't having as many kids.
And you know what? Scotland has been completely ignored. Northern Ireland has been completely ignored.
Don't forget Gibraltar, 90% didn't want this.
Swathes of the population are just thinking, if they didn't want this, well, what have I got out of this? And then plus, the people who have been failed as well by Tories, in the last decade,
I'm not a Tory.
where they have left places to rot, quite
Agreed.
frankly.
Which is
They
why our
haven't
policies-
funded public services. So it was very easy for Nigel Farage and his ilk to come in and put posters up and say, it's their fault, and we're about to receive all these people over from Turkey.
I'm really glad you mentioned the point about growth, because you may remember that Germany is still in the European Union, right? Germany is in recession.
According to this, Germany's still better off, as is Italy, France, the entire Eurozone. Isn't that interesting?
The United Kingdom is flatlining, but it's not in recession, right? The UK's growth since the referendum has exceeded Germany, has exceeded
That's
Italy,
because we
has
were
exceeded
so far
France.
behind because of Brexit. We plunged and then we made up for it.
So
and
when I
yes,
prove the evidence that you
no,
don't
Germany
like the
are
facts,
doing really
you
badly,
don't
but I
apply
don't
them.
care. I care about Britain.
You just talked
and we
about growth, and
in
I've
terms
just said
of the
that we're growing
G20, in
faster.
terms of the G20, we're doing worse than flipping Russia, who have been
No, because you're relying
sanctions
on
put
IMF
on
data
them.
from 6 months ago that
But
they
it's
just
the
had to
IMF
upgrade.
data who have
They
upgraded.
just
So
had to upgrade it.
do you believe them or not? Do you believe them or not? Because you're using IMF data to say that
What
we're
I
not going to be
believe
in
is that
recession.
Germany is in recession and Germany is in the European Union. And since we left the EU, we've outperformed Germany, Italy, Spain, and the only
That's a
country that succeeded this.
manipulation
It's
of
not a
figures.
manipulation. It's a question of GDP.
Here's where we are in the rankings as forecast in 2023 by the OECD. And Northern Ireland is outperforming the rest of the UK, bar London.
Teenagers, they are the first generation who are guaranteed to do worse than the previous generation. We have failing young people. They will not be able to get on the housing ladder. They'll be living with me until they're
The housing ladder's
middle-aged, which is okay.
Well,
but
and one of the reasons they're failing, it's hard to get on the housing ladder, is because we had unlimited freedom of movement. We had no idea how many people in the country. And that meant that when people thought there were 3.5 million people from the EU living here, it turned out there were 6.5 million
look,
people.
we know
That's
you're
the
very,
cause of the
very
housing crisis.
anti-immigration.
With less pressure on housing, younger generations will also find it easier to get on the housing ladder.
Isn't it funny, when it suits, it's nothing to do with Brexit, and when it suits, it's all to do with Brexit, and that comes down to housing. Wants to blame the poorest and the weakest in society for the failings of the rich and powerful.
Do you know what? Brexit to me just represents hassle. It represents wasted time, wasted emotion, wasted money. The EU, we know that
I tell you why it took a long time, because the Remainers, who said they would accept the will of the people, then spent 3 years trying to stop the will of the people. We should have got on with it with some proper leadership and done the job properly.
only
and then all of
reason-
the young people would be welcoming it because they'd be seeing even higher growth, they'd be seeing higher wages and the great opportunities.
Conspiracy theories again. He could have done it better.
I mean, we live in a global world, Jemma, not just a world that's centred around the failing EU.
The failing EU, the one that's got better growth than the UK. The one that's showing that Northern Ireland has got better growth than most of the UK. The one that seems to be resolute in dealing with Putin. The one with 27 countries and only 2 of which are still in doubt about the EU. The rest have overwhelming support because it's a response to COVID and Putin. That one, Richard.
It's just a massive trading bloc right on our doorstep for environmental reasons.
Who's
that
our
makes
biggest
sense
single
as well.
trading partner?
We have
Who's our
literally
biggest
just
single trading
found
partner?
out that we are not going to get a trade deal with the US. That was reported this week.
And who is our biggest single trading partner
The EU.
at the moment? No, it's the United States of America.
2 things to a certain extent, but imports, our greatest is Germany. We could reduce that instantly overnight. But on top of that, exports, you might say the United States, but look who's next. Germany, France, Netherlands, Ireland. Add that all together, even Switzerland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy. It's bigger than the US.
If we could get a trade deal where we could increase that surplus, great. But if we can get a bad trade deal, then no, we wouldn't do it. That's called sovereignty.
Here's Nigel making insane promises about that US trade deal.
What I saw with the Trump team were people who came from the private sector, not from the public sector, where time is money. And they said, do you know what? We can get this done and dusted in 90 days. Now look, whether it takes 90 days or 120 days isn't the issue. The point I'm making is that this new administration here has a can-do attitude.
And because Nigel is thick as shit, he didn't realise that the actual trade deal's got to go through Congress. It's not just Trump. And America has 36 million Irish Americans, which is a huge voting bloc. And they are not happy with the Brexit deal, with the Northern Ireland deal, with the effects of the Good Friday Agreement. But of course Richard Tice and Nigel are thick as 2 short planks, and they don't realise that.
Growth, you've talked about opportunities for young people, you've talked about higher wages, all of those things are possible if we do Brexit properly. That's why I want to get the lowest paid to get more net take-home pay by lifting the income tax threshold. That's one of the great opportunities that this government refuses
But that's got nothing
to
to do whether you've Brexited or not.
It does actually,
government
because if you
can
cut
do that.
unnecessary daft waste and regulations, then that frees up the money
I don't
to
trust
make
those getting rid of regulations. I actually like good food standards, good health and safety standards.
And do you like
and
cooking
I
on
like
all
clean
cookies?
water as well, like the EU Clean Water Directive, which now, they can just pour raw
that's got
sewage
nothing to
into
do-
our waters.
But we had sewage going into our waters before
We
Brexit.
did a bit, but not
because
as much, and we
because of
could
the
get
appalling
the-
behaviour of our privatised water companies that I
Agree.
want to nationalise.
Agree.
You
But
see, I'm getting you there. You're coming my way,
you're
Jemma.
not. No, I won't be voting for your party.
Jemma took him to town, and I hope some of my points added to that argument. Thanks again for listening. Thank you to all my YouTube and Patreon supporters who keep this channel going and growing, and so does your likes and subscribes. If you want to help out the channel, click it. It's for free, which allows me to then have some money to buy coffee to make more of these videos. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.